Okay. Now, Sally, you're a trained registered nurse, and for Patients Like Me, and you work for Patients Like Me, and it's one of the largest and most active networks of patient communities. It was founded in 2004 by brothers Ben and Jamie Haywood, whose brother died of Lou Gehrig's disease. It initially began with 10 patient communities, and it's since increased to 1,500 different communities with 200,000 users. What are some of the factors that have contributed to your growth?
I think one of the things that's just so compelling about something like Patients Like Me is that it began with a patient's story and a family experience. And that drove them to think about ways of being able to improve the experiences for other patients and families like themselves. So many of us actually have stories to tell that have to do with our health care and our ability to manage and to be able to navigate the system. And oftentimes, the people who are going to be most informative about what that's like on a daily basis, day in and day out, will be people who have experienced it themselves. So I think we hit a real opportunity to bring an environment where patients can actually come together, not only from the social perspective, but also what we provide them are research-based type tools where they can actually monitor their condition over time in ways that actually matter to them, and then be able to monitor that on their profile in a way that actually gives them some real feedback about how they're doing.
Sure. And I know this is probably a difficult question, but with 200,000 users and 1,500 different communities, give me a sense of what a typical patient community member is. How diverse is your patient population geographically, demographically?
Well, first of all, geographically, we are global. However, we are English only at this time, so predominantly English-speaking countries. However, I actually was just doing an assessment the other day of the European Union countries, and every country in the EU is currently represented. Obviously, those within English-speaking countries would be a larger number. But about 80% of our patients on the site are from the US, and the rest are from the UK, from Canada, and then a mixture of other European and Asian countries. Typically, the kinds of patients that we would see coming to Patients Like Me are people who have been not necessarily well served by the healthcare system. So they may have a condition that's chronic, that they're living with over time, that may change and exacerbate at different times, and they're trying to sort of navigate how best to manage that on a daily basis. Our main communities where we have the largest number of patients would be multiple sclerosis. We have over 30,000 patients in that group alone. Fibromyalgia has just recently eclipsed all of our communities, and it's nearly 35,000 patients. And then we have rare conditions like ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, where we have about 5,000 to 6,000 patients in that community. That's a large number of people with a very rare condition when you think there's only about 30,000 patients in the United States at any given time with that condition. So what we provide, I think, is an opportunity for patients to be able to have a place where they can put information about their experiences in a way that actually they can measure and better understand either how their condition's doing over time, maybe how they're reacting to a new medication that the physicians may have started them on, but really being able to give them a bit more control. Because when you think about it, about 99% of the time, patients are on their own. They're self-managing their care at home. It's the small amount of time that they're actually in the presence of a clinician, and it's at that point that you want to be sure that the information they're sharing is meaningful not only to the patient, but the clinician can actually do something with it as well to help them make decisions.
Sure. Now, patients use the website in part to monitor their own health, and they do that in part by using their own criteria to define how they feel. Can you give me some examples of what that actually means in practice?
Sure. Well, we do have what we call primary outcome measures that we actually create that are specific to a condition that a patient might have. And those are things our research team develops, and we do that through a whole process of development that can take 12 to 18 months to do. However, patients can come in and put in anything that they want in terms of an intervention that they're doing. So it's not uncommon for patients to actually enter in something about their pets. So their pets are actually an intervention that they use to help improve their mood, for example. And they can measure that over time. They actually do treatment evaluations on things like prayer. What is the impact of my saying a prayer every day on how I'm feeling in my overall quality of life? For some people, that's an important intervention and an important measure. One example that we've talked about before, which actually I love, is one of our patients, she was a bipolar patient, entered in a term called the cheesometer. And so when that data comes into our integrity team, we sort of looked at it and said, I wonder what she means by this. So we are able to reach back out to the patient and say, we'd like to better understand what this is and why you put it in as a treatment measure or a symptom measure to be able to start monitoring. And what she wrote back to us was, when she is feeling the desire to have cheese, she knows her mood is better. When her desire for cheese is lower, she knows that she's starting to enter a more depressed state. That's a very personalized, individualized measure that's not going to mean anything to me. But if I were to give her a 0 to 10 scale to measure what her mood might be like, it might not be nearly as valuable as her interest or not in cheese. So it's just one example of how patients can actually put things in that matter to them, monitor that, and then have some meaning that they can then have a conversation with someone else or even with their clinician about.
Okay. Can you give me a sense of how long your members are active in the network? Does it vary by quite a bit, or are they pretty dedicated?
It does vary, and it varies by condition. I'm going to say our most active and engaged community is ALS, and it's because I think it's our longest running community, and that population of patients have a lot of skin in the game. They have just been diagnosed or have been living with for a few years now a very devastating illness that really the camaraderie that takes place on that site is intense. However, they're also committed to advocacy, so they're very active in trying to find ways of being able to learn more about what's the underlying biomedical environment for this disease, what's causing those people who just randomly get it to get it. They're just trying to, they're asking lots and lots of questions. That group of patients actually has a linear trajectory down. So we know that they're eventually going to die of their disease or some complication related to it. Then you have people who have a disease that's going to be a lifelong chronic illness, and they would likely come in and out sometimes depending on how well or not well they are at any given time. A lot of patients actually choose to be on the site more actively when they have more social networking as part of their experience. So we have found in the epilepsy community, for example, when we did our user survey, we learned that about a third of the patients who completed the survey who have epilepsy had never met another person with epilepsy before. And that's a very stigmatizing and isolating condition. So the opportunity for them to actually engage with other people with this same condition, it's very frightening, was something that patients were telling us was actually improving their outcomes on a number of measures. They were learning more about what their seizure types were. They were finding more information about what side effects meant and how they might talk with their clinicians about that. They actually reported having fewer visits to the ER as a result of being on the site, much of it because of the social network component that they were involved in. We found that the more social connections that patients in epilepsy had, the better their outcome stats and their outcome measures were. So, it's a combination of the type of condition you have, its nature in terms of your ability to manage it and self-manage it well with the right tools, and then the components of being able to have other people like yourself that you can actually connect with and talk to.
Sure. Okay, well, getting back to the cheesometer member, how do you kind of take that, patient-defined barometer of health, and how do you then go over to the sort of a pharmaceutical company or a physician and what their kind of barometer for health is with that particular condition? How do you bridge that gap?
Well, I don't know that we'd bridge the gap with the cheesometer, frankly. However, what we can do and what we do with our patients who actually are not only putting in their own self-measurements, but we give them outcome tools to be able to put information in. So, for example, we might have a pain and function outcome score, and that will measure their level of pain, how that's impacting their functional status, whether they're able to work or go to school in the ways that they would like to do that. And that's actually a self-measurement that comes out with an outcome score, and they can monitor that over time. That can be a valuable tool to work with their pharmaceutical, with their clinician. A pharmaceutical company, on the other hand, maybe who's thinking about developing a new product in an area with the conditions that we have a large number of patients in, is probably more interested in the aggregate data to look overall, what is it like to have the experience of living with this particular condition. So they may want to look at the outcome scores, but they may also want to look at the way patients have actually described their experiences in their symptoms or in the kinds of interventions they're using, because it gives you an insight that you wouldn't normally have. So it's a bit of a combination of science and art, and also just the personal experience of what it's like to live with conditions like these.
Sure. Okay, fine. At the TED Med conference earlier this year in April, I think you talked about building quote-unquote patient lexicon to make it as easy for patients to talk about their conditions and compare notes as it is for doctors. Could you explain a little bit about what that means? Does that mean that members of the same patient population are finding it difficult to communicate, or does that mean a little bit something different?
I'd say in general, patients probably find it difficult to communicate. The language of health isn't necessarily the language of everyday life. So we've developed certain acronyms and different ways of talking about clinical conditions in ways that isn't necessarily intuitive to a patient. What we've done and what we decided to do early on was when patients actually enter in information on a symptom, for example, we don't change the way they wrote that word, the symptom experience. So the one I used in TED Med had to do with mobility and walking. So in a clinical concept, we would say they had a gait disturbance. But a patient might say, I felt like I was walking like a drunk as a result of a side effect that they were taking for a medication. So you could interpret that and code that, and what we do actually is code that to the clinical concept of gait disturbance so that we can aggregate it and understand it clinically. But the patient themselves, we don't want to change what they've said. We want to capture that richness and nuance because that had meaning to them. So it's really a way of being able to bridge the gap of being able to say there are ways to clinically describe something that's going to have meaning to the clinician that actually we can map to the way that the patient actually spoke about it. And our goal eventually is to be able to create a patient vocabulary that actually is mappable to the common standard terminologies like SNOMED, ICD-10, MEDRA, which is used for side effect data. And so all of the data that comes into the system actually goes through our user voice dashboard, is curated by our professional staff of nurses and pharmacists, and then we code that information so that we could ultimately find a way of being able to communicate with clinical databases as well as mapping it to our own patient vocabulary. So it's an opportunity for us to listen to what the patient said, put that into some perspective, understand it clinically, and then allow those two to have some synergies next to each other.
Sure. Okay. You're very upfront about the fact that you are Patients Like Me gives pharmaceutical companies and institutions access to patient data on your network in exchange for a fee. Can you give me some examples of how your network is influencing the dialogue with pharmaceutical companies,
Sure.
maybe with an eye to clinical trial design?
Sure. First, to clarify, researchers and pharmaceutical companies don't have direct access to patient-level data for the most part, and so they're not on the site exchanging information or conversing with patients directly. The way that we provide them data is we're aggregating the data and then making that available to them in a de-identified way, in an anonymized way. So we can map back to the individual patient level, but the pharmaceutical or the researcher cannot without having come through the firewall of Patients Like Me. And that's an important distinction that we think is really critical for patients to understand because we want them to trust us. We want to have the ability to be good stewards of their data and not use it in an inappropriate way. However, the data they are providing is incredibly valuable to a pharmaceutical firm, for example, who's really starting to think about going into a particular condition within a therapeutic area, but don't have the ability to access or talk directly with patients. What they are able to do is to learn about what the experience of living with these conditions, a condition might be like, so they can begin to think about that in the patient-reported outcome measure they might like to develop for a particular clinical trial, for example. It's very clear from the regulatory perspective today with risk management and risk-benefit assessments that we need to find a way of being able to integrate the patient from the very early stages of the drug development process all the way through to post-market surveillance, so that there is an engagement and a piece there that patients have actually contributed to in terms of understanding what the experience is like. It's really no longer appropriate for us to simply say, here's what we're going to create, we're going to impose it on people, and then we're going to ask them how they're doing with it. It's really, the time has come for us to suggest that patients have to have a role in this from start to finish. And the regulators are starting to see that, which is important as well.
Sure. Given this sort of the kind of furore that the NSA working with social networks like Facebook to get people's data has produced, do you find that that's had any kind of a chilling effect on sort of the willingness of patients to share data on patient networks like yourselves?
Well, I can't say we've assessed the Snowden factor as to whether or not that's had an impact on our patients. I can tell you in the assessments that we do from our user surveys and the way that we ask questions of patients about their willingness to share data. Their willingness to share data has two factors. One is that they want to improve their own outcomes if possible, but they also have an altruistic aspect to this, that they believe strongly in the idea that if I contribute some information, it may actually have an impact on someone else who has a condition like mine. So I think we underestimate the power of that patients actually want to harness this information in a meaningful way that actually can be better understood because they don't feel understood now in the ways that we've found ways of communicating. So, I think we talked about this morning in some of the sessions, the issues of privacy and confidentiality. It's our job to be sure we're doing a good job at protecting this data. If we can assure the people on our site that we are doing the best possible job we can with that, we can't ensure that some bit of data about somebody or some breach might not occur. I mean, nobody can do that in the internet environment today. However, we can employ all the possible safeguards we can to ensure as much security on that data as possible, and that's something we take quite seriously. So I'd have to go back and see if maybe we wanted to do an assessment of whether data sharing practices have changed over after some of the revelations of late. But I can tell you that we did have a breach a few years ago that was actually written up in the Wall Street Journal, and it was a researcher coming in inappropriately. It was a marketing research firm inappropriately coming onto the site and starting to scrape some of the data from the pages. We were able to pick that up with our security system within minutes, actually, that there was something inappropriately happening, that someone was looking at far too many pages, that a human could not possibly do that. So we were able to stop that immediately, identify the ISP, understand immediately that we had a breach, that it was actually a violation of our user agreement, and we were able to then deal with that appropriately. Our founders sent an email to our entire patient population following that, explaining what happened, letting them know that obviously we took every possible step we could to protect that, and we did see that there were some people who wrote in and said, you know what, this just feels too risky. I don't think I'm going to participate on the site any longer. But the majority of responses that we got was, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. I understand that this is not a guarantee of complete privacy, and I understand that there might be some opportunities for people to get information. It makes me a little bit more mindful of what I'm sharing, but I still want to share. So they may not be as explicit sometimes as they might have been before with something that might seem a little more personal, so that they're imposing their own sort of sense of security over the information that they are willing to share.
Okay, well, at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. If anyone in the audience has a question, someone will come to you with a microphone.
Let's see a few hands.
Thanks from Twitter. Not so much. Okay.
Someone's got a microphone.
Oh, right. Okay.
Did you?
Yeah. Oh, me? Sorry.
You
I
had a
wasn't
mic,
quite
so.
sure who you were talking to. So just on this last issue of sharing and mindfulness about sharing, Anita Allen, who's a law professor at UPenn, has recently written a book on one's own responsibility for protecting one's own privacy. But in an an area like yours where essentially what you're trying to do is find like conditioned people, what would be responsible sharing? Do you have any sort of advice for people who are thinking about participating in Patients Like Me and what's responsible and what's not?
Well, even on our privacy and openness policies on the site itself that you can read as part of the user agreement, we actually advise people to not use real names, to not even use real pictures. But patients will do what they want to once they get onto the site and add some of this information. But we actually do caution people pretty upfront about that. Now, we also have community moderators who actually oversee the forum conversations. And occasionally they will use some opportunities to suggest to someone, I see you're using your real name. We just would like to advise you that that's something that you've taken some responsibility to do yourself, and we can't assure your privacy on that. So, you're right. I think the important piece that we need to be thinking about here is that in many ways, I mentioned this to Stephanie before, in some ways we're getting to a point, I think, where health and healthcare is coming under new ownership, and the ownership is us. We actually have to take some responsibilities for our interest in sharing and learning and being able to connect with other people, while at the same time protecting as much as possible the kind of information we choose to share. Now, that said, there are things about your experience as a patient and the symptoms and the other kinds of things that you're experiencing that are totally so valuable for us to be able to collect. But if there's not a way of being able to bring that back to your self-identity, providing that information should not be a violation of your privacy. It should be an opportunity to be able to tell what your symptoms are, complete outcome measures, but still maintain some level of anonymity on the site. So we do encourage that, but I also encourage the self-responsibility on that a lot. So I don't know if that helps.
Okay. Anything else? One thing that I neglected to ask at this point, but are there any particular projects that you're working on that you're particularly excited about, or anything coming up at Patients Like Me?
Oh, great question. We actually have been working on, for the last almost 18 months now, what we call persona-based design. And we really have spent a lot of time thinking about the kinds of people who would use our site with certain types of conditions. And we understand that there are different types of people who like to do different things on the site, that not everyone's going to come on and want to be what we call a tweaker tracker. They come in every day and they're a quantified selfer type person and putting in every bit of data. So we have to build the site to meet other interests as well. So we might have someone who's more of an advocate and really is more interested in connecting with other people in the social environment. So what we're doing is we're actually using a very thoughtful process of developing new conditions with that persona-based design thought. And so we actually do ethnographic interviews in the field with patients, with experts in the particular clinical condition, to get a sense of the kinds of information they would like to see gathered, to get a sense what patients are currently using to gather data about their particular condition. And then we integrate that into the development process for us to be able to better understand the kinds of tools patients will find most meaningful. I think for a long time there was a sense that we could build it and they would come. And we've learned that we need to engage the patients as much as possible in the development of this, as well as the clinical experts and the research experts as well, in order for us to understand the kinds of questions we need to be asking on a regular basis. So I think if there was going to be anything I would suggest is going to be coming out in the next 6 to 8 months, it's our site design is going to look quite different, and it's going to be influenced heavily by this persona-based design work that we've done over the last 18 months.
Okay. Any new patient communities that are opening up?
Yes, we actually have a few that we're working on currently quite actively. We have the idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is a very difficult disease to be diagnosed with. The prognosis for it is very limited once someone is diagnosed, and the clinical tools available for those patients are limited. So we're very excited to be working with a pharmaceutical partner on that community and really developing the kinds of tools that particular population of patients can use, particularly because really the only successful intervention for that is a lung transplant. And oftentimes patients are diagnosed so late in the process that they're already not appropriate. So what we're hoping is that with increased awareness and better tools, people might actually be able to be more appropriately aligned with the opportunities for transplant. We have been working in a couple of different areas in psoriasis and other skin diseases, and we're actually in the process of doing a lot of development around area of symptomology of insomnia, for example. What constitutes someone's ability to sleep or not sleep? When does it become a condition versus a symptom or evidence of stress? And starting to better understand what that experience looks like from the patient's perspective. So we're evolving it to be a little bit more around what makes someone well, even in the presence of illness. So can we help promote wellness while someone's still living with an illness that can be serious and impact their lives on a regular basis?
Sure. And just as far as like the tangible impacts coming out of the dialogue that you're having with pharmaceutical companies and academic institutions and indeed the FDA, is there anything that you can point to that, or do you anticipate, drug label, wording changing or anything like that?
That would be great. One of the things we would love to be able to have an impact on would be able to bring more real-world information to the labeling process. And we have not been able to influence that as yet, but we certainly believe that the data that we are collecting is really the richest post-marketing surveillance data that exists today, because we actually have patients who are actively involved in being able to monitor that and collect it. I think the other opportunities that we have in terms of working with academic and other clinical researchers is to start validating patient-reported outcome measures. Up until the last few years, those have been sort of, used mostly in ways that clinicians have created them. They haven't necessarily created them with patients' involvement. And we've recently been awarded a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant to create an open research exchange environment where patients, researchers, and clinicians can actually work together on developing patient-reported outcome measures that actually reflect what matters to those three stakeholders, but really what matters to the patient. What should we be measuring that's going to help you better manage this condition, but will still contribute to science and our understanding of living with these conditions? So I think the contributions that we are making in patient-reported outcome measures, either at the drug development level or in the clinical intervention level, is actually going to have a huge impact in the coming years, because patients are starting to get much more interested in understanding what does it mean for me to live with this, how can I measure it, and as I measure it, I'm learning as a result. And that learning is continuous because we can feed that right back into the system again for other patients to learn from.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes?
So, two quick questions. One, how many disease state communities do you currently cover? That's sort of the first question. Second question is, to what extent do you partner with other online organizations that may focus on other disease states?
Well, we currently have, actually, we're probably closer to about 2,000 conditions today that we have on the site. Now, that said, we have maybe about 50 conditions within which the majority of our patients are. So, and as I said earlier, those for the most part are chronic, many neurological conditions, some that are much more associated with mood conditions. We have a large psychiatric population of patients, HIV and that kind of infectious disease group. Then we start to trail off to many smaller numbers of patients, but in rare conditions. So those smaller numbers may represent actually a relatively large group of patients for that particular condition because it's rare as it is. Where we are a little less impactful right now would be in the sort of the common experience of diseases of hypertension and diabetes, for example. There are sites that do an incredibly wonderful job with those kinds of diabetes particular, and it's not necessarily one that's a sweet spot for us. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have thousands and thousands of patients with diabetes, but they may also have multiple sclerosis, which is something that we do specialize in, or they may also have bipolar disease and things like that. So the other part of your question, we actually do work a lot with nonprofit organizations who actually have patient groups. We develop with them opportunities for them to have what we call landing pages. So they may come in and their patients might see our link on their site, link on, and then they come into a community that's already existing with some co-branding on that, like the Psoriasis Foundation, for example. A patient would come in and they would automatically be seen and welcomed from that group. So we do a bit of partnering in that particular kind of area and try to be able to have the patient acquisition part of it be something where we're getting engaged patients coming in because they came in through an organization of interest to them, and then when they get on the site, they are continuing that interest by starting to now gather data and collect data and put it into their profile.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you.
From
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today.